wanted to start off actually with Man United because
Mm.
last night's news was welcome news to some, frustrating news to others, a shock to some, what everybody expected. There's a number of journalists today that are licking some wounds on socials. I do feel a bit sorry for them. But Ten Hag stays at Man United. And what's your understanding around the decision for Ineos and co to keep him in charge?
Yeah, I think my understanding is pretty much the same as I reported before the FA Cup final, that we were going to have this review. And naturally, winning the FA Cup final is a big tick in Ten Hag's favour and one of the factors that was considered. But in addition, you've got that lowest Premier League finish. So the review did two things over the 2 weeks. One, it looked back at the season, and not only from a football sense, but operationally as well. And then the other thing was this projection amongst those doing the review as to what might change and what Ten Hag might be like in this new project, because ultimately were his hands tied by what he inherited. And I think that the challenge of the review and why it took so long is on that second point, because to project and decide whether or not Ten Hag is the right manager going forwards, which we now know that he is in Manchester United's eyes, you also have to look at other eventualities, and that includes succession planning and due diligence. So they had to go and yardstick Ten Hag against other names to see who they thought was the best football personality and strategic fit. And it might feel painstaking, and cynics may say, well, they met with Tuchel, they met with Pochettino, they thought about Frank, they considered McKenna and he signed a new Ipswich deal, and then they came back to Ten Hag, who was in Ibiza in the dark. But the reality is that Ten Hag, according to Manchester United sources, became the clear conclusion. And in a sense, it's true that Ten Hag was almost re-interviewing for his job. And like any interview, you would expect other candidates to be considered, because it isn't due diligence if you don't also see who else is out there in the market. And that's what makes the review thorough. But the good news is we got clarity heading into the window, which obviously only opens in a couple of days' time. Yeah. And on top of that, Ten Hag is in ongoing negotiations for a new contract. Now, remember, after his contract expires, there is an option to extend it by a year. But instead, Manchester United want to reward Ten Hag and discuss a new deal. And in the new deal, we might even see a change towards this head coach, and that will reflect in Ten Hag's role within recruitment and this new model. And I think people asked me at the time, why did Chelsea take super speed and Manchester United not? And the reality, I think, is because Chelsea have a more established model now. Those in charge have been there for 2 years. The recruitment team, the sporting directors anyway, have been there for long enough that everything is more settled. And we know that Chelsea have had their bumps and hurdles, but I mean strategically and executive-wise. Whereas with Manchester United, you've got Ratcliffe and his team that have only been in since February. You've got Omar Barada, who hasn't quite yet started. You've got an interim CEO in Jean-Claude Blanc. You've got Jason Wilcox, who is new. You've got Sir Dave Brailsford, who's done 100 or so day review of every department, not just the football one. You've got Dan Ashworth, who they've not even agreed compensation for. So you've got everything new about Manchester United, but it's not yet stuck and people are not yet in. And they're being asked to review a manager with very limited time spent with that manager. And this is why I think the impact of the last thing they remember from the season of winning the FA Cup, and not just doing so, but with an outstanding performance and a tactical masterclass, in my opinion, by Ten Hag, I think that counted in his favour. So Ten Hag stays, and now that's that for another Manchester United saga, and we move on to the window.
Absolutely. And look, I've been very honest about it. My personal preference was to move on from him. I just felt that, again, I'm looking from the outside in based on what we know. And we all as fans know less than everybody that's internal. But in previous years, I've been far more forthright in pushing for what I want as a fan, because I didn't trust the people running the club from a football standpoint, the Woodwards and co. I still stand by this. They're bankers, they're marketers, they're accountants. They shouldn't be making football decisions, in my humble opinion. But I felt differently about this. I had my personal subjective feelings towards Ten Hag. But I said all along that I'm going to be objectively supportive, because I'm going to trust that the football decision makers at the club, and I think we're all being really naive if the likes of Barada and Dan Ashworth are not having an input in situations. We've all worked in the professional world. We know how it really works. We've even heard about leaked emails, so we know something's going on. I'm putting my faith in the football decision makers to get it right. And I think some Man United fans have got to look beyond the end of their nose. They've got to get out of their own emotions and feelings and understand that the club need to build a foundation in this structure that will see us right in the medium to long term. And they've interviewed a number of other available managers. And there might be some better names out there, but they either didn't want the Man United job, didn't want to be interviewed, or they're not available. And in the end, we've decided that with everything that's going on, this is the best case scenario for us. Now, the proof is going to be in the pudding. I think Man United fans should drop their anger, drop their frustration, and get behind the structure being built and not become fixated on the manager. Because for me, Ben, what we're now doing is fundamentally different from any stage since Fergie. We no longer have a manager, in my opinion. We have a head coach. We will be taking away lots of responsibilities from him, and his job is to coach the first team in the way in which the club wants to play. And I'm glad that we're moving away from this model of essentially allowing the club to be built in the image of the manager, because we're never going to have another Fergie. The Fergie type eras are done now. So look, I'm not personally like jumping from the rooftops because Ten Hag's staying, but I'm happy that the saga's over and we can now move on to transfers. And when it comes to Man United transfers, Ben, what does it look like? Well, first player I wanted to ask you about was Ivan Toney. I saw a report yesterday that he's on a United shortlist. We've also seen him linked to Tottenham as well. What's your understanding about Man United and Spurs' pursuit of him and where he might end up by the end of the summer?
Yeah, I don't think there's a Spurs pursuit at the moment. I think with Manchester United, it's a possibility because we know even from January they wanted a more experienced striker. And it's that balance, isn't it? Because you need someone that can complement Rasmus Højlund. You need trust in Rasmus Højlund, but you also need goals because ultimately, unless Marcus Rashford adds another 30 like he did the season before last, there's a gap there. And you have to think about the now. And this is where somebody like Toney may come into Manchester United's thinking, but only if I'm told the price drops below 50 million. And there's no guarantees there. He's not on the Arsenal or the Chelsea list. I know we've repeatedly heard Toney linked with Chelsea, but as I've reported, and I can only give you my own knowledge, and I've said this for months, Toney has never really been in Chelsea's thinking, and we'll come on to John Duran for Chelsea fans a little bit later. But I don't think it's only Ivan Toney. There are other options that are less Premier League proven and fall into a slightly younger mold, and Joshua Zirkzee is one example of that. The feeling for weeks really with Zirkzee is that Milan are going to get that one over the line, but they haven't yet. And if something collapses, the door becomes open. And Manchester United and Arsenal have both seriously looked at Zirkzee as well. And then we obviously know they'd put a proposal on the table for Benjamin Sesko, but they were never one of the front runners there. It was very much, as I was told anyway, stay at Leipzig, very concrete and realistic possibility. And I think people were surprised when I said that. We spoke about that last week, and I've reported that pretty consistently before it was officially confirmed this morning. And the reason for that is because the player's got a very savvy agent. They know that in that kind of model, you can always get the move. You're never going to have a roadblock. You're never at that age going to be denied the opportunity to move to the Premier League. So it's about the timing. And he felt that settling his future before the Euros, having hopefully a big Euros, raising in value because of that, and then revisiting the situation in a year's time. And the 1 year extension just means that even without the release clause, a formal one anyway, the valuation is just the valuation, because in a year's time with a year's extension, you're ultimately in exactly the same place contractually speaking. So Sesko will still likely move in summer 2025, possibly in 2026. But from Manchester United's point of view, that gives away a little bit, because they were concrete in a proposal, the type of profile, and that leans more towards a younger striker. So it'll be interesting now to see if they pivot in completely the opposite direction and try their luck for Ivan Toney. At the moment, there's no real advanced discussions with any Premier League club, though, for Toney. And I'm told that Saudi could be one to watch as well at his age and with the kind of money that he's looking for. Let's wait and see if a concrete proposal emerges. When in January there was speculation about Toney, Saudi deal makers did make an informal approach, and Toney made it clear off the back of the ban for gambling because he'd only just returned to football, that he didn't want to resolve his future at that point and he didn't want to go to Saudi Arabia. So Toney, a bit like Lukaku, would have to change his mind, but just keep one eye on Saudi. And that's good news for Brentford, because ultimately, if they are going to sell this summer, they can leverage that kind of big offer, even if the player doesn't want to move. But I'll say one other thing on Toney, which again, I've reported before, but I'll just repeat in case you're not avid listeners to every word or every show on here. And that's that there is this other possibility, because Brentford can't afford a new deal for Toney due to the wages. They're not going to, in likelihood, extend him. And therefore, Toney could agree, because he feels very loyal to Brentford, to do one extra season, and then free agency comes into play. And that's when clubs may be prepared to pay the wage demands because the fee is removed from the equation.
Yeah, it's going to be a real interesting one with him. And it does. I know the transfer window isn't open, but it feels like quite a slow start. As you say, not much advance at the minute. We've obviously seen Tosin go to Chelsea. But look, Toney's a player I like, and I'd love a player like him complementing. I like some of the other young players we're linked to, but I do like the idea of somebody a bit older, a little bit more experienced in and around Rasmus Højlund for him to learn off as well. But we'll see in that space.